Hey everybody, it's Mr. Hefner again, and I've made the mistake today of wearing a green tie while using a green screen. Oh well, you can see right through me. Anyway, today I'm coming to you from beautiful Bar Harbor. I thought we needed a setting by the sea for the piece we were going to read today. We're going to take a look at a piece by a man by the name of Bartolomé de las Casas. He came to the New World shortly after Columbus's ships. In fact, he had been in Spain when he saw Columbus return from the expedition and the discovery of America. De las Casas is a priest, and he saw that the enslavement of the Arawak people, the Native American people who lived in the Caribbean, was absolutely cruel. And he was probably the first, maybe one of the first, but I would venture to say probably the first civil rights activist in the New World. So he's going to get a spot in our lesson today. I'm going to take you through the introduction and then give you a chance to read that. So let's get started. All right, first off, you notice here in this piece, like a lot of pieces in this course, you have the title, The Very Brief Revelation of the Devastation of the Indies. But then you have this little word up top that says from. And that's always going to be your indication that we're just reading an excerpt from a much larger work. And in case of this, it is really a small book, and we're going to read just a few pages of it. The author is Bartolomé de las Casas. He obviously wrote in Spanish, so we're reading a translation of that today. Should it still be considered American lit? That's up for question. It was written in the New World, not in the United States, but it was written in the Americas. And like I said, it's really important because de las Casas proved to be one of the first civil rights workers in the New World. So as always, we have a lesson essential question right down here. What's the literary and historical significance of this first person historical account? And that sounds like so many of the lesson essential questions in this unit. We're reading different pieces of literature, but we always want to look at what is the significance, both historically, because it's an important piece in time, and the literary importance because of the techniques that the writer uses as well. Now, again, we're not going to stop right now to actually write in a journal, but think about this. Some people see injustice and they stand up for it, and other people see injustice in the world and they turn their heads and walk the other way. I like a television show. It comes out every summer. You've probably seen it. It's had many seasons, called What Would You Do?, in which the producers set up a moral dilemma for people to watch. So it involves actors creating the moral dilemma. And then the cameras watch to see who hears this, who's around, that actually steps in and does something about it. And then once the interaction has happened, the host, Quinones is his last name, I can't think of his first name, he steps in and he asks the people questions like, you know, why did you get involved? Why did you do this? How did you feel about that kind of thing? So think of this piece like that. We're in a piece of history in which the native people were seen as primitives. They were captured, they were used, and they were disposed of if they died. And everybody just thought, well, that's the way it is, until de las Casas becomes involved. And he says, this is immoral. And he was a priest in the church, and most priests just simply blessed the process of, the practice rather of slavery. He stood up to it. All right, there's an early image of de las Casas working away. You don't have to remember all of these. I'm just trying to give you an idea of who this guy was. So he was born in Spain in 1484, right? You know that Columbus discovered the New World in, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So you have an idea of when Columbus came back. 1493, Columbus comes back from that trip where he had arrived in the West Indies. He traveled to Rome with his brothers and things, and he actually met with the Pope. He was a priest, and he also met relatives of Columbus while he was there. So by 1514, he had already been to the New World, and he realized that these native people were really suffering at the hands of the Spanish soldiers who had come there. He goes back to Spain, he meets with the king, and he advocates for the rights of the people. And he's kind of given lip service. The king gives him some certain powers to stop the abuses and things, but he's one man in the New World and the abuses go on anyway. What he tries is he tries a peaceful colony. Can we have a colony in which we live side by side with the Arawaks, convert them to Christianity, which was one of his primary missions, and at the same time not make slaves out of them? He started the colony, but unfortunately it kept getting raided by Spanish ships who were taking the people away and forcing them into slavery anyway. Later on, 1522, he writes a general history of the Indies, very important book, and later on he revised parts of that down here, and that was his brief relation of the destruction of the Indies. That's its title in Spanish on the screen right there. And he died in Spain. So this is from your textbook here. It's the about the author, and I've highlighted some of the most important parts. So the part that we're reading highlights some of the things that were going on the island of Hispaniola. And you probably recognize that name. That's the island where we think Columbus may have landed. Hispaniola today is the home to both the Dominican Republic and Haiti. So both of those countries are on the single island of Hispaniola. The people who lived there were the Arawak, and they were imprisoned by the Spanish. They were used as slaves in all kinds of ways, which we'll read about in the piece. When they died, they were simply thrown overboard into the sea. They were sold, they were exchanged, and yeah, it was probably probably some of the worst, most violent slavery that's ever gone on in the New World. So this savage treatment is what we're going to pay attention to. Most of the native people were killed in these areas, and just today, I mean, there are no pure blood Arawaks living in the world anywhere. As a pure blood race, not race, but culture, they have been completely wiped out. Now, the literary tools we're going to look for in this piece. This is a translation, so these aren't necessarily the exact tools that the author may have used. We're going to look for the mood of the piece. Another term for mood is atmosphere. In other words, as you read, what is the feeling in you that's created by the piece? And that feeling can be created by all kinds of things. It can be created by the actual words that are used, the descriptions that are in there, the pace of the piece. All of these things come together to create an emotional response in the reader, and that's the atmosphere or the mood. The second one is going to be point of view, or perspective, if you will. So we know that grammatically we have first person, second person, and third person points of view, but we're going farther than that. In here, we're going to have a first person point of view because De las Casas was there. He saw this going on. He's not relating to us stories that were told to him by someone else. But at the same time, you have his point of view, his perspective of being a priest, being someone who's outside the norm in wanting to stand up for what others see as primitive people, if they even see them as people at all. So we want to look at his view as a priest among soldiers to help the native people affects the story as we're going. Now, these are the two literary tools that are provided by your textbook, but I'm going to add a third because I think this is a really good piece for it. And the third one that I'm going to add is one that you probably know, and it is hyperbole. And hyper means anything above. Hyperbole is an exaggeration, and it's an exaggeration to make a point. Sometimes we do them intentionally, and sometimes we do them accidentally. And I believe, I sure hope, that this piece is filled with some hyperbole. If you want to get people upset about a particular situation, if you want to get them motivated to become involved, you have to paint a picture that will motivate them. And there are some descriptions, I'm not going to spoil it right now, but there are some descriptions in this piece that are so horrific. They're unimaginable. I hope they're hyperboles. I know that what went on must have been horrible and cruel, but I hope that these are hyperboles that the author put in to motivate people. All right, there's the island of Hispaniola on the map up top. As I said today, that would be home to both Haiti and the Dominican Republic. We're going to look for ways in which the author's language conveys mood, this atmosphere. We're going to look for various aspects of point of view as we go through this. It's a point of view which is going to be very different for this author than it would have been for almost anyone else in that time period. And finally, we want to look at like it's pretty obvious why this piece was important in its day, but we want to also ask, why is it still important today? You will find this piece in American literature textbooks all across the country from many different publishers. So there's got to be something about this piece that keeps it important to this day. And we're going to leave that up for our discussion later on. Now, again, here are your literary terms: mood. When you're finished, I'm going to ask you to find 4 examples of concrete details that support mood. So it might be a description. It might be a setting. It might be the choice of one word over another. You know, you can have 2 words that are synonyms. They mean the same thing, but one has a certain connotation, an emotional definition that goes with that. And then point of view. We're going to be talking about how this point of view was very different for the time period and the way in which De las Casas made this point of view come across. So these are the 2 things we're going to be focusing on as we go through the piece. Quick historical note, just some other things. After this time period that De las Casas writes about here, he attempted that peaceful colonization. As I said, he had the permission of the Spanish government, but the Spanish government failed to protect them. And it was actually Spanish galleons that were attacking, and they continued to steal away the Arawak people that he was trying to protect. He tried to end slavery in Hispaniola, and in fact, it was against the law. And so he worked really hard at this. It was against the law, but it was one of those things where the law was Spain. And now we're in the new world, thousands and thousands of miles away. There's no immediate communication. It takes months for a ship to go back and forth. And so even though it was against the law, it was practiced as if it was perfectly legal. Later on, De las Casas became a bishop in Mexico. And again, they had anti-slavery laws. He couldn't enforce them. And ultimately, the anti-slavery laws in Mexico were repealed. And slavery was very common. And if you remember back to the beginning of this unit, we talked about 1619, the Jamestown colony, and the arrival of the first African slaves brought to Jamestown. Those African slaves were actually taken by force from a Spanish ship that was taking them to Mexico. So Mexico had a big issue with slavery. All right, so I'm going to go through these right now. If you want to, stop, read the piece, and then come back to the questions. But let's go through the questions, and that way you'll have these for your notes. According to this selection, why were the native people defenseless against the Spaniards? And you have, they thought that the Spaniards were gods to be obeyed. The Spaniards' maps were better than the natives. The natives had poor weapons, or the Spaniards far outnumbered the natives. And the correct answer on that one is the natives had very poor weapons. The narrator tells us that compared to the demi-culverins and other types of guns that the Spanish had, the weapons of the Arawak people were basically toys. Why were flocks, and that's one of those hyperbolic type words, why were flocks of native people given to Spanish ship owners? To serve as sailors, to guide the ships as they explored the islands, as repayment of money invested in ships, or because they were dying and needed medical attention? Correct answer on that one, it was repayment of money. So those who hired the ships had put some money into them, the money needed to be paid back, and it was done in the form of slaves. How about this one? When did the native people finally attempt to fight back? Now, this is according to the author. It was A, when the Spaniards attacked the noblemen in the villages. B, when the Spaniards forced women to cook for them. C, when the Spaniards had stolen the last of their food. Or D, when the Spaniards refused to release the captured pearl divers. Correct answer again is when the Spaniards attacked the noblemen in the villages. And again, the author in this piece tells us that when the Arawak fought back, if they killed one Spanish soldier, the punishment then was 10 Arawak people would be selected and slaughtered in return. And so the idea is to teach them, we're more powerful than you are, and you can fight back, but you can't win. De las Casas said that the Spanish ships could navigate the Caribbean by doing what? Looking for bodies of native people, following trails of discarded food, learning the patterns of waves and currents, or forcing native people to serve as navigators. And I hope this is hyperbole, but he said, traveling several leagues. Now remember, a league is 3 miles. And traveling several leagues, the narrator tells us all you had to do was follow the bodies floating in the water, because the ship ahead of you had tossed them over when they died. And there are enough of them in the water that you can just follow the trail of floating bodies in the Caribbean. I hope that's hyperbole. In the last paragraph of the selection, De las Casas notes that native people were publicly sold despite what fact? And even if you haven't read the piece yet, we talked about this so much in the introduction. Slavery was illegal, and yet it was going on as if it was, you know, the rule. All right, 3 true and false, and then we'll wrap this up. True or false? The narrator seems sympathetic towards the native people. Sympathetic meaning he feels for them. He understands their plight. And that, of course, is true. Number 2, the primary organization of this piece is chronological. So chrono means time. And whenever you have a narrative, and this is a narrative, narratives are always chronological. They may jump around. You may have something like a Forrest Gump story that starts at the very end, goes back to the beginning, tells the whole story, and then goes to the end and wraps it up with just a little bit more. You know, it's not completely in time from beginning to end, but time is how it's organized. And so that is chronological order. And number 3, the author seems to be writing from personal experience, and that's absolutely true. He was on those ships, he saw this happening, and he tried to step in and make a difference. All right, now, one last thing. We're not going to discuss this or answer this right now, but I'm giving you a little peek to the end of the unit. When you get to the end of the unit, there are always going to be some essay questions. And one of the essay questions you're going to see at the end of this unit is this question right here, word for word. What is the historical and literary significance of this piece, the very brief revelation of the devastation of the Indies? Think of how it was important historically then, and think of how, as a work of literature, it remains important to us today. Right? We don't have slavery in the Caribbean anymore. And yet what this piece says still speaks to our society today. And you need to come up with that. All right, so that wraps it up for today. If you haven't read the piece, make sure that you do read the piece. Hopefully you read it in between and then came back for the questions. But that's what we have for From the Brief Revelation of the Devastation of the Indies by De las Casas. Thank you if you stayed with me to the end, and I'll see you next time.